Hi everyone, it's Emma here and I am talking about understanding your period and hormone imbalance. So what I'm going to talk through, I personally think is just fundamental for women to help understand their periods, their monthly cycles and what lots of their hormones might mean. This really helps to set us up for managing our symptoms in the best way possible. It can be really confusing. It's not something we're generally really taught that much about. All the ins and outs of the hormones and what they mean and how we can support them. We're often taught about pregnancy and quite basic parts of this, but I would love to help more women just understand the kind of fuller spectrum of what is going on with their hormones, what they mean and how they can help manage them. So firstly, just a little bit of an introduction to sex hormones, but I don't want to go in too deep. But basically in males and females, we have sex hormones that are released from our reproductive organs. So that's the testes in males and the ovaries in females. However, there are some other glands around the body that can also release some sex hormones, such as your adrenal glands and also adipose tissue, so excess fat. Fat cells, which is why potentially being over or underweight can also influence our hormones. But primarily in women, the ovaries are the main modulators of our sex hormones, although there is other hormones as well, such as progesterone, which works slightly differently, but I will go on to talk about that. The sex hormones are so important for everything from actually having sex to sustaining a pregnancy, to breastfeeding, and just for generally helping to maintain our bodies. And we'll know this for anyone who suffers from PMS or monthly symptoms. We actually have estrogen receptors for one all over our body, every inch of our body, and that means they can actually give rise to a surprising number of symptoms. Menopausal women as well will know all about this. So the effects can be quite varied and widespread. So there are some typical female hormones and more typical male hormones. So female hormones, you have estrogen and progesterone. Male hormones, you have testosterone. But we also, both males and females, have a balance of all three of these hormones. So it isn't just inclusive to each person. But obviously the main female hormones that we are going to mainly focus on today are estrogen and progesterone. They are the main ones that influence us on a monthly basis. So these hormones fluctuate, which is often what gives us symptoms. So these can be quite mild fluctuations, such as in men where their testosterone levels fluctuate very gently across the day. But those fluctuations are quite mild, which means they don't often really notice. Whereas unfortunately females tend to experience much bigger fluctuations, which is when we can experience more symptoms. So that's on your typical monthly cycle. You'll notice different symptoms as the month goes on, and then also in other times, such as in pregnancy and in menopause. And many of the symptoms we experience are down to these fluctuations in hormones, which can be very powerful. So I'm just going to quickly talk through a bit about the menstrual cycle and how the hormones generally fluctuate throughout the month, and there is also a visual for this, which some of you might find more useful. So I'm just going to focus on estrogen and progesterone. There are some other hormones such as LH and FSH, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about those ones. I'm just going to try and keep it quite simple. So the first day of your cycle is known as day 1, and that is the first day of your period. So a woman will bleed on average 5 to 6 days, but of course this can fluctuate and change also depending on your hormone balance. But generally, as we start to come to the end of our period, that's when we start to see quite a significant rise in our hormones, mainly estrogen. So after that first quarter of our cycle, estrogen then starts to rise, usually for around a week on average, and then it peaks. And this peak in estrogen is what triggers ovulation. And this is a key part of our cycle when an egg is released, which if we were to become pregnant, the egg would become fertilised. However, if the egg doesn't become fertilised, what happens then is estrogen levels drop off, and instead the ruptured egg sac, which is called the corpus luteum, it starts to release progesterone. So this is actually the main source of our progesterone, which means we actually have to ovulate in order to have enough progesterone generally. So that's something just to take note of, that this second half of our cycle is progesterone dominant, and that has come about as a result of ovulation. So for the second half of the cycle, progesterone starts to rise, and our estrogen levels instead start to drop off. And this trend continues. We have a kind of peak in progesterone around 3/4 of the way through our cycle, and from there, when the body realises that the egg hasn't been fertilised, if this is the case, then progesterone levels also start to fall off, as well as your estrogen levels. So from there, the hormones start to drop quite dramatically, the two hormones, and this is generally what gives rise to our periods. This kind of more sudden drop off in our hormones, and that's when your lining of your endometrium starts to shed. So that all sounds very plain and simple and quite easy, but we do know that hormones can fluctuate. So this is interesting that your hormones might be doing what they should be, enough to give us our ovulation and our period, but actually beyond that they might be fluctuating enough to also give us some additional symptoms, and even the symptoms of PMS. So this is really what's happening if our hormones aren't behaving. These fluctuations can become quite significant, and this is what we call estrogen or progesterone dominant. So as I say, although your hormones are perhaps still doing what they should in order to trigger ovulation or to give you your period, they might actually be fluctuating enough or in different ratios to each other enough in order to trigger some kind of unwanted symptoms. So that's what I'm going to talk through, some of these scenarios, and tell you about some of the typical symptoms to see if some of you might recognise some of these in yourself. So first of all, we have estrogen dominance. So I spoke about estrogen. It's released from your ovaries. It's a kind of primary female sex hormone, if you like. It can be very helpful for us. It helps to maintain a lot it has a lot of positives, from positively influencing your digestion, your skin, things like that. But that can change when the ratio of estrogen to progesterone changes, and that's where we can risk becoming estrogen dominant. So estrogen dominance tends to present itself with some of the very typical symptoms of PMS that some of us may be aware of. So that tends to be symptoms like irritability, mood swings, tender breasts, bloating, water retention, and very painful heavy periods, often kind of that heavy bleeds. In terms of the length of your cycle, so from period to period, in some cases it could be on the shorter end. So the average cycle length is 28 days, but that's not, not everyone has a cycle that length. But if estrogen is quite high, it could be quite slightly shorter, and ovulation might be slightly earlier, and that's just because estrogen in that first half of the cycle is quite dominant, and it might be triggering ovulation that little bit earlier, which results in a shorter cycle. Next one to try and identify would be progesterone dominance. So this is interesting because we've talked about how the corpus luteum releases your progesterone. So this is quite a similar process each month, and there perhaps isn't as much leeway for there to be too much progesterone as there could be, because your ovaries have such big control over that. But what can happen is we can perhaps be high in progesterone relative to estrogen, and that is if your estrogen levels are on the low end. So we say progesterone dominance, but that could actually also look like low estrogen, and this is an imbalance that's often experienced during menopause, but actually we're learning that women much younger are also experiencing this much more, and also quite often after coming off hormonal contraceptives, for example, your estrogen levels can just take a little bit of time to build up again, because your body's not being so reliant on you making your good natural estrogen and high levels of. So in terms of the progesterone dominant symptoms, we're thinking you're quite low in a lot of respects. So that can be your low mood, quite weepy, quite emotional, perhaps low self-confidence. Also your skin might suffer. As I said, estrogen is very nice for maintaining your skin, so you might be a little bit more prone to acne if the structure of your skin just isn't quite as robust. And then in terms of your cycle length, you might actually have a little bit of a longer cycle, so perhaps a bit longer than 28 days. And that can be because, as I say, high progesterone, low estrogen. So perhaps the first half of your cycle is a bit longer. You're actually taking that little bit longer to ovulate. And I know this from personal experience, that this is definitely me. I'm definitely low estrogen, and that first half of my cycle is usually longer than the typical 14 days. So I'm probably on the low estrogen side of things. Just going to quickly touch on testosterone dominance. It's not one I'm going to go into in huge detail, but this imbalance is quite often associated with a condition called PCOS. And again, it's all about ratios. The androgens, or testosterone, the kind of typically male hormones, which of course women have as well, can sometimes just be more dominant over some of the other sex hormones, the estrogen and progesterone. But I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'll give you a little bit more information next, as I'm just going to talk through some of the remedies for each of these scenarios as well. So to help put these imbalances right, I must stress to you that this could be, an hour-long webinar in itself. So diet and lifestyle factors are key, especially eating lots of whole foods with all your nutrients to support the balance of your hormones and the primary structure of your hormones. Also, lifestyle habits and areas to focus on are wide and vast, but stress is another one which can really potentially influence our sex hormones. So just to clarify, it's not all about remedies, but I do want to obviously talk through some options, but diet and lifestyle are one to consider primarily. But for the estrogen dominant state, the remedy of choice would be Agnus Castus. So for that high estrogen state, typical PMS with those typical symptoms, your Agnus Castus is licensed to help relieve some of those typical symptoms that we mentioned. So the tender breasts, the painful periods, and the irritability and mood swings. So that would be your choice for the estrogen dominance alongside your diet and lifestyle. For the progesterone dominance, the low estrogen, that would mainly be your fermented soy isoflavones. As I said, these can be popular in menopausal women, but also can be really helpful in younger women. And as I say, I'm definitely in that category, and I have tried that approach myself. So fermented soy isoflavones, which you can also get in supplement form. Finally, just quickly touching on the PCOS testosterone dominance. Although it's affecting your hormones, actually, as I mentioned, diet and lifestyle, especially for this scenario, is key, and it's all about blood sugar control and insulin sensitivity. So it really would be about managing your intake of refined carbs and trying to increase complex carbs and more fibre and lovely protein and healthy fats to help slow the release of those more refined carbs. So I hope that helps. As always, if you like my videos, please also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also hit the bell icon on there to get any additional videos.